When I started in venture, I couldn't have articulated what's the way that Fred Wilson does things versus Vinod Khosla versus John Doerr. I've just come to believe very strongly that 90% or more of the investment decision for me at a seed stage is the founder, and maybe even as much as like 95+%.
Maybe to take one step back here, because I think people see the Generalist today, and it's an incredible newsletter and community. What was the point that gave you confidence to leave your job to go all in on this?
I think I was probably a little irrationally optimistic about the fact that if I really put my mind to this, and once I had sort of like a rough form factor around this newsletter, I think probably my ego kicked in and did enough of the rest that I was like, all right, maybe I can pull this off.
You had an incredible piece on Founders Fund, which is extraordinarily concentrated. In times of peak ambiguity like this, where we might be in a bubble, is the concentrated strategy the best way to go, do you think? All right, I've got Mario Gabriele here, the founder of The Generalist. Welcome to Change Order.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I am excited to reconnect with you. We have been friends for a while. I knew you when you were an investor, and then you moved over into being one of the most prolific writers, I would say, in tech today, who I enjoy reading every piece from. Your writing, I would argue, is really famous for its depth. It oftentimes exceeds 10,000 words. Can you walk us through the manufacturing process, like of an actual article and a piece for you?
For sure. Maybe depth is maybe too complimentary, but definitely length. I'm not the best when it comes to brevity. In some ways, manufacturing makes it sound like I really have a really dialed in process, but the truth is that it's a lot of fumbling in the dark and figuring these things out. And you do, start to get a little bit of a muscle around it, but each piece is super different. So the really only things that are extremely common are just like a ton of research up front, taking lots of notes along the way, and then trying my best to get from one side of the piece to the other. I mean, I can dig into the pieces there in more depth in whichever way is most interesting, but I think a lot of times people are sort of surprised by how mundane this is. It's like a lot of things that there's no real like massive tricks or techniques that I figured out beyond just sort of sitting down and trying to do it.
I feel like when I talked to Alex Conrad about his process, it's almost as if he's thinking a lot like an investor as well. He has to be really selective about what pieces and what companies he wants to write about. How do you really decide what you want to write about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I bet if you're Alex, there's sort of different pressures. Now he's doing his own thing, as I understand. But, when you're working for a big organization like Forbes, maybe you feel like more pressure to have, a piece that is going to capture a broad enough attention and stuff like that. For the Generalist, I am lucky to just sort of think, okay, is this really interesting to me? And do I want to spend probably 50 plus hours or, often several hundred plus hours learning about this? And I think I've just sort of become more comfortable realizing when that's not the case, even if it's a story that in theory could do well. I don't know if I think about it always like an investor for these things, because frankly, the writing, the bar is very different on the writing side, right? Like you can get away with something being just interesting. And that is totally fine for a piece. Versus an investor, it could be totally boring, but fantastically profitable. And there's just sort of different concerns on both sides of that.
Are there certain themes that you feel like you gravitate towards the most?
I think I just get really excited about sort of strange people. And so when you feel like someone is a very, like a one of a kind in some dimension, like that, then I start to feel like, ooh, I really think I could spend a lot of time trying to figure this person out in some way, trying to figure out why they've constructed their view of the world this way and why they're deciding to build this thing because of it. So that's what I kind of probably get most excited about.
Does that usually start with a meeting the person in real life, or is it usually like you read some article or listen to some podcast and then decide, wait, I kind of want to dig a little bit deeper there?
I think it probably usually starts without meeting the person, just because in a lot of these cases, I'm convincing the company that this person runs or the fund that this person runs that it's a good idea to let me in the door. I'm sort of like I'm a vampire, right? I have to be invited in before I can see everything. And so usually it's a feeling you get from the outside from reading this person's work um, or sort of studying their work in some way that gives you the sense, oh, this person's like super unusual. And it's not that hard, right? There's, lots of information about people out there. And most of the time, I think you can get a good feel uh, for whether this is someone who is like authentically playing their own game on whatever dimension that is.
So maybe let's use a specific example. I really enjoyed your piece on Hummingbird. I think it was back in the day. Uh, you came up with that idea how, and then what did like even the first 48 hours like post coming up with the idea look like for you?
That one was an interesting one because it was a super long like incubation cycle. So um, I think it was a couple friends who had been operators and investors in Europe, sort of independently said, this is a really interesting firm. You should consider taking a look at it at some point. And you get a lot of these sort of ideas at various points from people, so I didn't take it too seriously. But it came back, I think, 3 or 4 months later, and then again, sort of 3 or 4 months after that. Um, and when you get a few of those signals sort of in a row from people that you think, have good taste or have interesting networks, it sort of convinced me that, okay, I should take a closer look. And that one, actually I think was very hard to figure out from the outside that it was as interesting as it was. And probably, well, when you meet, I don't know if you've met Barend or Farhat, the sort of two GPs there, but when you meet them, like they're extremely interesting in person in a way that like they just are not very public. So that one would have been hard to figure out without these sort of hints along the way.
And I guess you mentioned those guys are not very public.
Mm-hmm.
And so you probably had to get in the door and convince them the way that you were saying earlier. What was that process like? Was there a lot of preparation and pitching, or how did you end up getting them to say yes?
I believe that another member of the team was familiar with my writing and thought it was good. And so as a result, like that person was sort of an internal champion and was like, hey, I think, we should maybe consider doing this for a fund that is sort of famously private. And so there's a lot of these sort of timing things that play into it. Sometimes you catch people at just the right moment where they're sort of ready to be a little bit more outspoken or a little bit more public. And I also think just the nature of the type of pieces that I've ended up loving to write the most appeal to like sometimes a different sensibility of person who might ordinarily be more private. Like if you're sort of someone who's quite private, there's some part of you that doesn't want to do like a Forbes piece or a TechCrunch piece. I'm just sort of picking these because we mentioned these publications. But if someone's like, hey, I will sit down and write like a 20,000 or a 30,000 word piece after studying you for many, many months, then you sort of at least feel like your story is going to be done justice in some way. And I don't think that's something that a lot of traditional publications are sort of able to promise on some dimension.
Doing someone justice, I think, is such an important part of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh,
I
thank
think,
you.
I won't take words out of your mouth, but I think there are other publications out there that stay a lot more surface level. And as a result, the pieces just aren't as interesting, aren't as insightful. Yours is just like packed, I feel like, with insights.
Oh, thank you.
What is the research process for you? Like, how do you come up with the step by step? Hey, I need to go do this in order to really put together the recipe for what ends up being a piece.
I really try and do as much primary research as possible. So interviewing the people or seeing sort of like company or fund collateral. Obviously, there's plenty of secondary sources that you can look at in many cases, and it's good to sort of familiarize yourself with that. But I find that actually having a conversation with the executive team of a company and a bunch of their customers and perhaps some of their investors, just adds color you can't get anywhere else. And especially for a company where maybe there have been a lot of articles about sort of fundraises, but no one has sort of pulled together the entire chronicle. There's usually like big gaps in the order of operations of things that you actually almost need a guide from within the company, and usually many, because company is a big organization. There's lots of things happening simultaneously, but you need someone to sort of say like, you know, almost here's the timeline of it, and here were sort of the distinct phases, and here were the characters, because otherwise you're really struggling to put the emphasis in the right place. You can start to do sort of funny things that, without meaning to, you can start to like put too much emphasis on someone who, when you actually talk to someone at the company, they're like, hey, look, that person was great, but like they really didn't move the needle here. Or, vice versa. This person, no one's ever heard of them, but they're really essential in this company's history. And so, getting in the door just gets you at least several degrees closer to, I don't want to say the objective truth, but as close to the reality of that company story as you can get, hopefully.
And I mean, primary research, I feel like nothing beats it. At the same time, a lot of people are both getting lazy, but also smarter with AI. How has AI changed your workflows?
I've almost gone sort of the opposite direction, especially over the past, let's say, few months. I really do love AI for sort of compiling a lot of that secondary research where you're sort of able to say, hey, maybe I would have had to spend several days chasing down every piece that is, archived or not archived across, all these years. And that can just be sort of tedious, busy time. And so AI is quite good at that and pulling all the sources together. Um, but it doesn't really help you fill in those like quite important gaps. And also I've just found that there's some level of synthesis that has to happen from the AI. And that synthesis has a valence to it one way or another, even if it's trying to be sort of perfectly objective. And in some ways, I find that like not super helpful when you're trying to craft the story yourself. And then the other piece of it is it's really hard, I think, even for an AI to truly figure out what's going to spark something for you. And so when you go back to even, these old funding announcements, when it's synthesized in some way, there might be one or two things that were in there that get taken out that actually like are quite useful and spark something in your understanding of the company that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So all to say, I certainly use Claude every day to answer lots of different questions and do research on different things. But when I'm like actually trying to go super deep on something, I end up just doing like as much of it as I possibly can, sort of in a very analog way, for lack of a better phrase.
Speaking of like evolution of writing style, you at one point were doing, I think, the S1 Club, and we're doing it in a multiplayer model with some other folks really contributing. Since then, you've pulled back from that model. What was the initial thought process going into doing that? What was your hypothesis that maybe did not play out exactly as you had hoped, and why did you end up pulling away from it?
Yeah, honestly, the generalist, and probably, personally, I'm in a constant state of like reinvention I like to try these different things and test out a new series or a new way of doing things. And maybe it's something that really works super well for a year and I enjoy it. But there's, a mix of both. You yourself get sometimes a little bored of doing the same thing. And then also there's sort of moment in times where something works better than others. So the S1 Club was basically this series we did where we'd invite all these experts to analyze an S1 ahead of an IPO. And in 2021, that was like a really great thing to do because there are all these IPOs coming out. Everyone was super curious about it. I also, frankly, like knew much less. I still have so much to learn, but analyzing IPOs was not something I'd done as a seed investor. And so there was
Why not?
yeah. Hopefully you get to do that when things, really start working. But that was a really exciting way for me to learn how people further up the stack thought about these things at a really deep level. And so, I think the reason we pulled away from it was just like all the IPOs dried up. And I probably also found that the coordination was extremely challenging on these multiplayer pieces. But I did learn a lot from it, and it was an experiment that I was grateful for, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I love the thought in the way that you are experimenting over there. It really comes across like you're taking true ownership over being a founder of your media property.
Oh, thank you.
And I think one other experiment that it felt like you went through was this evolution of the free model, the
Mm.
paid model. Can you just walk me through your thinking from those decisions?
Yeah, so the business model of the Generalist has sort of gone through a few different cycles. Started totally free just as I was sort of building the audience and figuring out if this was viable, even from just an interest perspective, like were enough people even vaguely intrigued by this. Then I turned on a paid subscription. That didn't do badly. It was actually, became viable pretty quickly, but it started to become a little bit tough to grow when you're paywalling so much stuff. And so then I actually flipped almost entirely, well, yes, entirely to a free model with a paid community. So sponsorships, that was a totally new motion. That also worked decently. But I think what I've realized is something that honestly probably everyone who had an actual media background would have come up with very quickly, which is that like the right answer is actually sort of both. Like you want a subscription tier ideally, and if you can figure out the right sort of set of products for that, it can do really really well. But there are some things that just suit sponsorships better, and it's not a either or. It's sort of figuring out, you know, which pieces of content fit both of those models. So um, that was one evolution, and then the community piece was something that we tried for a good 3 or 4 years, but it never really worked. That's sort of partially just failure on my part. Like I do sort of think someone could have come up with something that would have worked better. But also a little bit of nature of the business. It's not we don't have a niche in a traditional sense. And so when you think about creating a really valuable community, it tends to be better to have greater density within a certain group. And so if we were, to take a really thriving community, Lenny's product community, those are all really, like connected people through their function. And I'm sure there's tons of variety, but still there's sort of this underlying connectivity. And the generalist is like, you know, some hedge fund folks, some investment banking folks, some operators, some marketers, some venture folks. And you could have sort of these chaotic, interesting collaborations and conversations that emerged, but there wasn't really enough of a shared interest or value that you could get from one another to keep a community growing and really active.
Maybe to take one step back here, because I think people see the Generalist today, and it's an incredible newsletter and community that people get a lot of value out of, and the writing is like one of those things that like anytime I see you post something, like I have to go read it.
Oh, thank you.
But when I remember meeting you, you were in venture capital, and I forget if did you start writing the Generalist while you were at Charge?
Yes. Although I think you and I met even before that at Retsi. So,
That is true. Yeah,
so
we did meet when you were at Red Sea.
years and years ago, like almost a
Yeah,
decade.
but what was the point that gave you confidence, that gave you the conviction to leave your job to go all in on this? Like, where were you guys in this process?
Why did I have the confidence to do that? It's a good question. I think it's like, frankly, I'm, to let you in on the warped aspects of my psyche. I'm a little bit arrogant around the fact that I have some ability writing, and I've always sort of felt like I'm actually good at this. I can sort of feel confident that, in school, after school, like this is something that just naturally works for me. There's lots of things I'm not good at, but this I can do. And so I think I was probably a little irrationally optimistic about the fact that if I really put my mind to this, and once I had sort of like a rough form factor around this newsletter, vaguely the things I would talk about, and the first sort of indications of traction, I think probably my ego kicked in and did enough of the rest that I was like, all right, maybe I can pull this off. And so, it makes it sound very heroic, but it was ultimately just starting a newsletter that has gone well, and is still very small in many ways. But in that respect, thankfully, I had enough sort of courage to give that a shot.
What were those indications of traction? Like, where were you when you ended up deciding to leave?
I'd have to look at the exact numbers, but like a couple thousand. So really not big. Like to me, that at the time that seemed really big. I thought, wow, this is crazy. Like, maybe I'll get to 10,000. That'll be amazing. Um, but yeah, I think I was perhaps a little irrational, and honestly, I was still nervous about it. It didn't seem like a particularly objectively good career move, but I thought there was very little to lose, and it felt it felt intuitively right somehow.
Were you looking at like the retention curves and being like, okay, I have like a base here, little safety net?
No, definitely not. I don't think I would have known how to really like even think about that or what I should care about. I was just sort of like, okay, people seem to enjoy it among this small group, and I'm having a really good time. And also, there's all these sort of softer things that happen. Like, you'll write a piece and you'll hear from a bunch of people who you would never have met otherwise. Even in those really early days, I'd meet someone who I was like, wow, I could never have gotten access to this person with me as a junior VC saying like, hey, would love to meet you for a coffee. And so even in these sort of less obvious ways, it was sort of like, wow, there's something that I'm creating that's valuable here to people that what I'm doing otherwise is not that valuable to them, to this world, to this sort of industry that we're in. So I think those were, maybe more indicative to me.
When you look back over the history of the Generalist now, were there certain inflection points or pieces that really solidified your already high confidence level, but to give you even more conviction in what you were doing and taking things to the next level?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if you have like a high confidence on anything, you also probably have like a deep insecurity around it. So, I bounce between those on writing. But but yeah, there were a few inflections. Honestly, the biggest one was just COVID, full stop, sort of as a period of time. I think I got really lucky um, to launch in that era because the growth for every like newsletter, I think, from many of my peers was like really strong. And there were a lot of us sort of coming up in that era who, when COVID ended, were like, hey, are things like quite a bit less good for you now? And so I think there was also a little come down from that. But um, yeah, there were individual pieces that did well. So um, I had a piece on Tiger that at one point was like a very big piece that drove a lot. We had a piece on a series on FTX that was in hindsight not the best, but was a very popular series, and I think we got a lot right except the most important thing. Um, and
Sounds like a VC with a zero, by the way.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so yeah, there was lots of these moments that tend to sort of align with the zeitgeist in some way. It's not always that way, but usually it sort of works when you say something interesting about something that is really in people's minds, but somehow no one has kind of like done the work to tell it or dive into it enough. And so, there are lots of those little spikes.
It is the real model that if you're aligned with the zeitgeist and you put out a piece, that the growth ultimately comes from referrals and people forwarding it to you, or where does the growth come from in the model?
That's probably the right way to think about it. Now, a lot of it seems to just come purely from being on Substack and being like one of the larger ones in our category. There's enough of a network around that now that they are constantly bringing in new traffic. If you're one of the larger, tech business newsletters, there's some amount of discovery that happens. And so there have definitely been times when I feel like we've had to work a lot harder for top of the funnel. But as that ecosystem has sort of grown around us and we've sort of gotten a little bigger within it, uh, it's gotten a bit easier. And I think there's some sort of benefits that we don't deserve any credit for, but just like continue to help you grow.
How important do you think market timing is here? Like, do you see there being still big opportunities in this whole Substack world and the future of media? Like, would you give advice to somebody who's at a big publication like a Conrad again today to leave and go start their own thing? Or do you feel like that window is rapidly closing?
No, I think there's always space, and like I sort of feel the same for podcasts, right? Like there's obviously more podcasts than anyone could possibly listen to, and there have been for a really, really long time. I'm sure it was easier if you started 10 years ago to sort of establish your voice, and I'm sure it's, was easier when I started with the Generalist, but ultimately there's a decay in a lot of in a lot of news sources and stuff like that. So I think lots of things that people read today will be much less relevant to them in a year or two. And there's always opportunity for new voices. I think the thing you just have to be really ruthlessly honest with yourself about is like, are you delivering something of value over a replacement publication? And I think a lot of times folks maybe fall into this trap of like, I will do the same thing as this person with 2% difference. And then it's impossible to do, to win. And so you have to just like, yeah, believe that you're doing something significantly different. And, for me, I found that like the way to do that is to just do more research, more depth, longer pieces, because everyone is sort of, or a lot of the landscape has just shifted towards sort of smaller, faster. And so that's, felt like the better bet. But there are lots of ways to play it. And I certainly hope that if someone like loves writing, they can find a way to do this for a career, because it is extremely fun.
It's pretty interesting. I feel like the media vertical is giving us the case study for the anti-AI slop.
Yeah, totally.
Like in many ways, you just mentioned it. It's like you're going to go deeper, you're going to do more research, you're going to be longer form content, probably less consistency. I think the Acquired just announced they're going to only do 8 episodes next year.
Oh, wow. 12. Yeah, there you go. That makes sense.
It just shows that higher quality content that is, less frequent is probably where more of the value can be derived versus, the surface level dopamine hits that could come from people just leveraging AI in order to get eyeballs.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if you're like unbelievable at memes and you really like doing it, you should do that version of it. But I feel, but even then you're really sort of in this almost like high frequency trader motion where you're competing for every like few seconds with the rest of the very, very fast media makers out there. So that's not a game I think I could win or would enjoy. And so, yeah, I think I would love to see, I think there could be 10 more generalists at least, if not many more than that. We just did like super long pieces on different parts of tech.
I want to shift gears now. I think there's really 2 reasons why I was excited to interview you. The first one was just understanding, your process to writing and your journey a bit more. But also you're getting back, into the investor seat. You've been back in the investor seat writing checks. And I think you've described the writing process as a technology for developing conviction. Can you unpack that a bit for me?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't 100% remember saying it, but it does sound like something I might have said. And I can appreciate the point I might have been making. Writing is I think just the best way I've found to sort of clarify your thinking and also get away from like really fuzzy thinking. I think it's very easy to win a verbal argument, even, maybe with yourself. When you're sort of talking through an investment, you can sort of think, oh, maybe this, maybe that. And when you sort of start to put things on a page, it becomes really hard to do that, because you kind of have something to push against and say explicitly, well, okay, that like strictly doesn't make sense actually. Or, here are the things that you should be thinking about. There's always sort of this natural, interrogation, I think, that happens when you're writing about these things that maybe doesn't when you're thinking about them or just talking about them aloud. So from an investment standpoint, I find like writing in general is really useful. And then the Generalist happens to, be a really great vehicle for me to spend a lot of time with very valuable companies in this space with great builders in this space, getting access to useful information. And so, it's not that I'm writing pieces on companies that I then invest in, but it does give me a really helpful way of seeing what an exceptional company looks like, what an exceptional founder looks like, what a market might look like from the inside of one of these organizations. And so it's sort of a different motion than a traditional VC that I think ends up looking a little bit more like equity analysis or something like that. And that's quite helpful for me, at least.
Do you think that's where the world of venture capital is headed, though, is into this like equity research world where specialization is key?
Well, I sort of like of the belief that you don't want to specialize too much as a VC. I understand why you might, as a organization, want to create specializations, but if I'm sort of just purely thinking of myself as a solo investor, I think so many of the best companies end up being born at these weird collisions of multiple spaces and having sort of some dimension of one space sort of transmuted across to another. And so my fear would be that if I specialized too much, I'd like miss that sort of magic, that like category breaking miracle. So all to say, like, I don't think I think that's one way venture could go and people could win that way, but I don't think that's like a trend I think will be the dominant one in our space, let's say.
So what truths, after studying all these different VC firms and different founders and companies, do you believe today that maybe has evolved over time?
Well, I don't know if you were the same, but when I started in venture, I feel like I was really just trying to get a handle on even the sort of different styles that great investors had. Like I couldn't have articulated, okay, what's the way that Fred Wilson does things versus Vinod Khosla versus, John Doerr or whatever it is. And so you almost don't even know what the flavors on the menu are. And of course, like the ultimate goal is that you sort of figure out exactly what to apply and not copy, but just, steal in productive senses. And so probably the things that I've found resonate for me, and it really, I think, is personal based on your style. Like I've just come to believe very, very strongly that like 90% or more of the investment decision for me at a seed stage is the founder, and maybe even as much as like 95+%. And I think certainly when I started out in venture, I probably would have spent a lot more time interrogating the idea someone brought me and the market dynamics and how much early traction there was. And, frankly, learning from organizations like Hummingbird, which I wrote about and now I work as a venture partner at as well. I've really now sort of focused almost exclusively on just like trying to figure out who the person is, and if they have some of these characteristics that might make them truly exceptional in some way.
I want to come back to that in a second, but I feel like I had in my prep notes for this interview that you had said ideas are wildly underrated.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, these are sort of two, well, I want to separate the idea of business idea from just ideas, because I do think sometimes like there's lots of ideas that, don't have to be just purely the startup idea. But to me, they're sort of very connected in the sense that like, I need to know that this person's going to be capable of generating tons of good ideas over the lifetime of a company. And so in some way, I'm not too concerned if the idea they've brought just at this exact moment is perfect. Although it would be great if it's really interesting. And I do think you should use the idea as a proxy for their depth of thinking and stuff like that. But if someone brought me like a truly interesting idea, but didn't seem to show the ability to generate tons of new interesting ideas, I don't know if that would be that exciting, if that makes sense. And so there's really sort of like a generativeness in the person that connects to that, but is a little separate from it too.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think about the line, you put a great founder in a bad market and the market will keep its reputation. The founder won't. At the same time, though, would a great founder start a company in a bad market? Like, will they bring you a bad idea? And especially as founders get later in their career, if they are bringing you a bad idea, I'm much more skeptical,
Hmm.
versus earlier in someone's career, they're far more dynamic. They
Yeah.
haven't learned a lot yet about market structures, and where are the tailwinds and what are the hooks and the wedges that can help you get in there. And it feels like the younger founders might have a broader spectrum of ways that they could end up going versus like the older founders. They should probably be a little bit more narrow and a little bit more surgical when it comes to their entry points.
Yeah. Also, you do get these great founders who start with super terrible ideas, but because of what you said about their dynamism, it doesn't really matter. They're gonna figure it out. They'll quickly you know break their nose on whatever it was that they were trying, and then figure out the next thing. And this was an interesting rotation they went through, but yeah, you don't want to, in my opinion, at least over-index on it. But frankly, I'm in no position to pontificate. I have not returned a fund yet or anything like that. So there's a long way for me to go.
I mean, honestly, and transparently, I think this is what I find incredibly challenging about seed stage investing, where if you're a high conviction, low volume firm, betting on a great founder who hasn't done necessarily all that work yet, or betting on a founder who seems great but is not in a great market, feels like to me a very hard formula whereby you could just wait for another great founder to walk in the door with an idea that's much more flushed out. Now, the market right now feels insanely efficient to me, like insanely efficient. I mean, I've had meetings with founders where honestly, I've had 5 times the amount of customer calls that they've had
Hmm.
come through the idea, but they're getting a $30 million post because they came out of Stripe, um, and it makes the job far more challenging. But at Hummingbird, like they're pretty high conviction, pretty low volume,
Yeah.
right? So maybe talk to me about what you've learned over there, starting with the balance of founder versus market. And then I want to just ask you a couple questions about the way that you evaluate founders today versus, in prior years because of your work with them.
Maybe the different spin that they might put on it would be uh, that they sort of would be skeptical of the idea that another great founder is just going to walk through the door with a better idea. I think they're trying to set the bar so insanely high on the person that they'll sort of, they'll take on risk in other places because that is not just sort of like a 1% person in their view. It's a 0.01% person. And so it does mean turning over 1 million shells on the beach each year and looking at tons and tons of companies and doing very few deals. But I think as a result, they feel confident in taking that risk in a slightly different place that I think most investors won't, right? They'll say, okay, like I'd rather wait for someone who is still a 1% person, which is usually a super impressive person, right? But has a more buttoned up idea. And so it's just different places that these firms, I think, actually end up. It's one way to think of venture is like, where do you buy risk? And like, I think they are buying risk in a different place than a lot of funds. And I really like that version of things because it sort of subscribes to my interests and proclivities on the one hand, but also sort of aligns with what I can see of these great companies that they do go through so many weird rotations where, they have a totally different idea, they pivot, they, almost die, et cetera, et cetera. And the one sort of unifying thing is that to build a truly massive outcome, it's hard to find someone who isn't just like a real anomaly on several dimensions, and in a way that you could backtest rather than saying like, yeah, right now, okay, it's great to see that Jensen's a really remarkable guy. Like, no, you could, I think, through their lens, have figured out some of those things quite a bit earlier. So anyway, those are I sort of half answered your question, I think, but there was another half that I let myself totally lose track of. So you might have to bring me back.
No, that was great. And I want you to unpack that a little more. Like you're looking for anomaly outlier founders. If you were training an associate today, how would you train them to identify that?
Honestly, you'd probably have to sit in a lot of calls with the Hummingbird folks to really see how they do it. Um, but they have a very different set of questions they like to ask. They know, they've done this now for so long that their pattern matching is just, again, like quite different than a traditional VC. They're pattern matching based on like psychological traits versus, uh, business model traits. And so there are just even little nuances in a conversation that they'll pick up on and be able to articulate in a way that I'm like, whoa, okay, maybe I felt something in that moment, but I couldn't put my finger on it, or I couldn't explain to you what happened. And so they are really detectives in this, psychographic way almost. And so I think, if you were to train an associate, I think you would almost want them to look at the world as a pure talent investor as much as possible, to ask like much more personal questions than a traditional VC.
Such as?
Like asking this person a lot about their childhood, about and in quite a lot of detail. And so, it's easy to say, hey, you should just ask them about their childhood, but there's really a lot of like nuance in how do you get someone to actually be willing to be vulnerable with you, and what's the right way to do that, and all these sorts of things, that sort of like come in just watching them do it. And so I am at the very tip of the iceberg of learning from them, I would say, but it strikes me that there's a really deep uh, craft to what they do that is quite unique as far as I found.
Are there any other investors that you personally have tried to emulate now as you've studied more and more and tried to add different tools to your toolkit?
Hummingbird is definitely the one that, for me, sort of best aligns to my view of the world. But there's definitely lessons I try and take from lots of folks. I mean, I think um, Altos is an incredible firm, especially when it comes to the level of concentration that they've been able to achieve with their biggest winners. They sort of rose to prominence publicly in the sort of pandemic era because they had Coupang and Roblox IPO. I think it was the same week, and they were huge shareholders.
Not too bad.
Exactly, not a bad week. They were huge shareholders in both, but I think their view of the world, they focus a lot on what they would call a hedgehog, and this sort of person who has one big idea and is really devoting their entire life to it. And so I haven't been on the inside of that firm, but it wouldn't surprise me if they have really attuned so much of their process toward little nuances in figuring out like, okay, every founder you talk to will say they really care about the company they're building, right? Like that's sort of just, it has to be said. But there are probably really useful ways of figuring out this person will, like, no matter how many failures, hold on to this idea, use different sources of growth, et cetera, to hang on to it. And so that's a model that I don't understand as well, but I would say like intellectually appeals to me a great deal. And it's sort of, again, that sort of idea of really going deep into the person and their mentality, that appeals to me.
It's interesting you mentioned them because my partner Ben, was also an investor in
Yeah,
Coupang
right.
alongside them, and I feel like the level of conviction that people had in Bomb as a founder, is incredibly high. Now, that is also one of the most complex businesses ever to be running, and requires somebody with the ability to think big, but the ability to get into the weeds. And I feel like it's the same thing with something like a Roblox too. I mean, those are complex
Mm-hmm.
businesses, like a first time founder has a hard time, or operator walking off the street, launching a game like that and being able to get into the minute details of retention and engagement and what levers could they pull to, drive significantly higher numbers
Mm-hmm.
there. And that oftentimes, honestly, is one of the things that I find the most impressive about founders that have built multi-billion-dollar companies. You sit down with them and you can start, head in the clouds. But if you want to get into the detail of, oh, what was that different cadence of, reaching out to customers to do upsell motions, they'll tell you exactly what it
Yes, it's
was,
like that zoom in, zoom
and like
out.
what were the breakthroughs.
Yeah, totally. And in Baum's case, you'll know better than me, but I think it was his first company, right? Like Dave Bazzucchi from Roblox had done something, but
Baum had actually started a magazine
oh
company.
wow, no kidding. Huh, how
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, and then that business had scaled basically with the Groupon model. I mean, I think that was like 1 billion of revenue or something like that, and then they pivoted it into the Amazon model, and you know, it just shows though like how important uh, learning velocity is, and how you need to go hunt down insights to try to avoid a lot of the mistakes that have kind of been made before you. Because what did Baum do? He like met with some of the best people at Amazon, and he learned a lot.
Yes. Yeah, incredible business.
When you're thinking about the industry today, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned it. I think we've now known each other maybe then for like close to a decade at this point. Um, what's your current state on the market and view of where we're at?
It feels pretty clear to me that AI is a bubble, and I think everyone is sort of aware of that at this point. I think you have to be, yeah. I think even the biggest bulls are sort of like, yeah, no, we're in a speculative bubble. I think the questions are sort of like, okay, it seems like it will be a relatively productive bubble, so that's good. It's like less, um, I think it's less likely to be destructive from that perspective. There's obviously concerns around the technology, but um, I think it makes everything really, really hard for the average investor who's not either at one of these like hyper aggressive firms where you're sort of making the bet that you're just like much less valuation sensitive, or at like a true tier one huge brand name firm that you can still sort of do a degree of picking. But even those folks get pressured, right? Like everyone's in this game. So it wouldn't surprise me if in a couple years time we have some amount of data that shows like a lot of the best managers were just a lot slower during this period, and maybe sat on their hands a bit more. And maybe they will have missed some big things, but I also imagine there will be a lot of ones that folks look back on and don't feel so great about. So I think it's all so much about the time horizon we're looking at, right? Like I was talking about this with another investor. Like, okay, are we in 1996 of the dot-com boom, or are we in 1999? Like, how much time do we have left? And it feels impossible to know. But it's gonna have to detonate at some point. So I think you have to prepare for that in some capacity.
I guess what aspects do you think of this make it a bubble?
Oh, I think like, you know, these companies being done at 300x revenue is very bubbly. I think some of these interconnected financial relationships are very bubbly. Like, you can start to see all these sort of classic signs, right? Like domain names going for huge amounts of money, all these interconnected sort of transactions spinning around, the speed of growth for some of these companies that isn't necessarily seem super sustainable. Now, some folks are growing just very fast and it feels like, maybe there are decent fundamentals there. And then, yeah, just the valuations on a lot of these things, it feels are pricing in a trajectory that it feels, super optimistic over a longer period of time. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I think it's incredibly hard to compare to the dot-com bubble. I do think that back then, a lot of the companies had upside down unit economics or no revenue model at all. I think that right now there are companies that have upside down unit economics, but I'm not involved with any of them. None of them in our portfolio have upside down unit
Mm-hmm.
economics. And it does feel like a moment of time whereby there's a paradigm shift. I mean, I remember doing AI investing. I was calling it the future of automation in 2017 before I joined Primary. And I had AI debt collection companies. I had AI accounting companies. The margins took a lot longer to climb. But the more interesting piece to me was that the customer acquisition costs were much higher. The churn was much higher, and the velocity of them just was not at the speed that it is today because sales cycles were longer. But today, it feels like we're seeing far more jaw dropping customer experiences that really are unlocking new budgets. I mean, some vertical SaaS companies I'm involved in are capturing as much as 15% of labor
Wow.
spend within companies. And those are the ones that are growing super, super fast. The question to me becomes, uh, what happens when the next guy comes in? How high are the actual switching costs? What happens if a company that's now using, you know, Codex or Claude to write code launch an adjacent product that's in your lane and they start giving it away for free? Because now it's going to feel more and more like Hunger Games and a lot more like the Uber versus Lyft battle, where, I think I was talking to Bill Gurley a few months ago, and he's like, I don't wish the whole Uber Lyft situation on anyone.
Mm.
Like there was no playbook for that. And it was stressful. But he felt like, this is going to happen more and more. And I agree, because the optionality for us as even just software investors now, for which directions do you want to take these companies and their product roadmaps and their pricing strategies, is all net new.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think in a lot of these cases, there's lots of new like user behavior being born, and that's obviously a huge opportunity that someone will, maybe lock in this new paradigm and be the winner of this. But as a result, there's also a lot that I'm not totally sure if they're enduring. Like, will we, you know, chat now feels like surely we can't move away from that, but maybe who knows? Maybe we will move back to more like uh, graphic user interface, or maybe voice will start to become much more important. There are all these different things that just feel like a lot is up for grabs in a way that it wasn't before, which is exciting, but also easy to over extrapolate.
I do wonder about the chat thing myself. I mean, if agents are
Mm-hmm.
successful, um, my bet would be we move towards what I'll call like an action first interface.
Mm-hmm.
So, imagine all of these apps that have worked really well have been these like card based,
Yeah.
swiping type of interfaces. And if you want to introduce a human in the loop into an agent based
Mm-hmm.
system, the easiest way to do it is make it so they're not super
Yeah,
ADD,
no
they're
kidding.
super
That's a good idea.
focused.
Yeah.
And then it's like, yeah, do I want to go and like ping that, customer? For sure. Do I want to order that thing? Yeah. Like, whereas right now, like chat just takes
It
too
is.
long.
Yeah.
Like I'm on my, my thumbs are already starting to curl. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if I can sustain this for the next 5
Yeah,
years.
totally. I think that's a great point.
And then I guess when you think about the B2B ecosystem today, it also does feel like, even though there are incumbents out there, that a lot of these upstarts are playing towards this like new feeling, this new experience. And maybe it's just the American way of thinking. I'm curious to actually get your take on this, but like Americans always love trying the new thing, like social currency and like sharing and whatnot. So when people talk about are the incumbents going to win, I think at least for the next 12 months, the architectures of their code bases make it harder for them to launch new products quickly. But number two, even upselling and attach rates on software have never been 80 plus percent, and so if there is a new brand out there, I do wonder if those are the ones that end up becoming more successful, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
That's a great point. I do think, yeah, there is sort of this early adopter mentality, especially with AI, that people are just excited about, right? We all sort of want to play with it and see what it's capable of in all these different ways. I do wonder at what point, the maybe the slower folks catch up and just have a different degree of robustness, accuracy, integration, whatever it might be, distribution, that, how that plays out. I think it'll be so case dependent. I certainly think there will be lots of incredible companies beyond the, already massively large foundation models that are born during this period that will, still be around in 10 plus years and probably doing amazing things. But you do just see any vaguely plausible idea at the moment is getting 10 companies funded to try it. And that's a dynamic that is just really, really tough, right? Tough for anyone. So that's the part
It's nuts.
that I can't. And also for ideas that you're like, maybe that's a new behavior, but I really couldn't, like, I mean, you always have to take some amount of speculation here, but yeah, like, the AI browser thing is something I've been spending time with as a user. And I'm like, yeah, it is nice to press Command E and be able to talk to a tab. but is that a forever thing? Is that like $1 billion innovation? It's all these things that are tough to sort of parse out.
mean, it's funny when we first got into venture. I think the way that market structure ended up playing out was you usually had companies that were selling to like the enterprise, then you had the mid market, and then you had down market. But there used to only be two companies that got funded,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe each one of those. Now it's like you write a check. There's four, five, six other competitors, that
Yeah.
pop up in literally the next 3 months, and it becomes a lot more challenging. So that brings me to a question I have for you, which is you mentioned, Altos, and you had an incredible piece on Founders Fund, which is extraordinarily concentrated. Thrive, another firm that's extraordinarily concentrated. In times of peak ambiguity like this, where we might be in a bubble, is the concentrated strategy the best way to go, do you think?
I think it's just really hard to concentrate on what most people would perceive to be your best names at this in this kind of a market, because there's just so much demand that things become exciting too quickly for folks up the chain. And so, you would never have been able to concentrate as much as Founders Fund is in SpaceX in the modern era, right? Like it wouldn't, there'd be too much competition around it. There's too much sort of American dynamism energy that, there would just be more competition. So I still am just ultimately a believer that concentration drives returns. And so as long as your selection is good, of course you should try and concentrate as much as possible, but not at any cost, right? And so I think there will be companies that, in the fullness of time, will look back on and realize, oh, Founders Fund or whoever it might be managed to quietly build, a 30% stake in this business that no one really cared about. But I think it's hard to do that when everyone is looking maybe at the same set of names. So I don't know. It certainly seems like they're willing to deploy a lot of capital into folks like Cognition, which is in the peak of this heat. I wonder how much ownership that translates to. Maybe if things do sort of burst at some point, maybe that becomes the opportunity where you get to put a bunch more capital to work and sort of help folks get through the harder times. But yeah, those are the firms that I find most exciting. Just the willingness to take those big risks on and really, yeah, follow a company story for 20 years or something.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, now that you live across the pond, I'm wondering, like, where do you see the blue ocean? Is it over there? Is it chasing down companies in Europe, or where do the opportunities lie?
Man, if I knew, I would definitely not tell you, because I'd keep that to myself. No, I have no idea. Like, there are some really exciting companies that are getting created in Europe, and I do um, believe that. I do think there's sort of still work to be done on Europe's side to be like competitive almost psychologically with America. Like, there's just sort of a different cultural uh, orientation that I think makes it a lot harder for people to build truly massive businesses here. But I think you're seeing some really promising organizations. So, Lovable is, perhaps the most obvious one, which has been growing like crazy from Sweden. Um, but but yeah, I don't know where the next space is. I often try and think about that, and certainly spent time sort of thinking about it through the lens of Founders Fund, because they've been so good at finding the next wave before everyone else. And in many ways, their big, their sort of prescience is now much more commonplace, right? Like defense, industrial, all of these things are things they've cared about for a long time. So I do wonder where they will orient themselves with next. But I couldn't tell you. I wish I could.
It's a great question. It's an absolute great question. I think we're all trying to figure out.
Yeah,
Maybe AGI just takes our jobs anyways, so we just need to be in every company.
that's yeah, exactly.
Um, well, I know we have a few more minutes here. I guess one fun story I'm curious to hear from you
Mm.
is you almost got sued by a hedge fund at a point in time.
Yeah.
Tell me about that story.
Oh gosh, it was a really early in the generalist's life, or at least early in me going full time on it. It was a fund called Durable Capital, which I think they're still around and probably doing quite well. Well, it's been so far back. Exactly what happened. Okay. I collaborated with someone on a piece about compounders, by which sort of the idea was companies that grow 20% plus a year over, a 10-year spell, let's say. So at that point in time, examples were someone like Netflix, like they had just sort of in the public market steadily grown at this extremely impressive rate. And the person I collaborated with had learned about them at Columbia Business School and had worked as an investor. I believe they'd worked as an intern at Durable at one point. And sort of this was just like a philosophy of investing that is by no means solely Durable's sort of idea, right? Like the concept of compounders is quite well known. Um, and so he sort of wrote a piece for the Generalist that I edited a little bit on this concept and sort of some of the traits of these companies that people could consider looking out for. And his old boss got very upset about it and said that this was Durable's intellectual property. I think this person might have gone like slightly rogue because I didn't get the sense that I don't want to the broader organization should have cared about a Substack with like 5,000 people. Um, but anyway, we really tried to resolve it extremely amicably, where we were sort of like, I think a lot of this is quite common terminology, quite common ideas. Like maybe you could tell us, what's one or two things that are especially that feel really like intellectual property to you, and maybe we can take those out, or maybe we can have you write a piece and add to it, and so you get credit. Like we tried every possible um, version to not get sued. But they really kept escalating this in a way that was kind of good. I mean, still, and honestly, with more hindsight, it becomes more bizarre to me. Um, and thankfully, I had a friend, an internet friend, who knew a pro bono sort of defamation, media lawyer to protect against these things, not defamation, whatever you call these sorts of things. And we put them in touch and said, if you really want to turn this into a lawsuit, like we now have representation. We're happy to sort of argue that phrases like good to great and compounding are not sort of unique IP to Durable. And then I wrote about the experience and published it through the Generalist, and it really turned into, for an evening, a little bit of a Twitter firestorm, such that they backed down quite quickly. So, sorry for the very long explanation, but it was I was sort of recalling it for myself there. It was a strange one.
It's a great story, though. I mean, you had 5,000 subscribers at the time. It takes a lot of conviction, I feel like, to kind of do that and to stand up to them. How did it change your perspective on, going to war there against in big moments?
It just gives you more confidence that you're like, okay, people will certainly try and bully you at various points for reasons that seem so strange. And I think, especially as someone, finding their feet in an industry, and there's a big organization, they have, however many billions under management. I think there's sort of a temptation to sort of just defer to the authority of it, and like, I must be in the wrong on this in some way, like surely I've made a mistake. And so I think it was a good experience in realizing, no, people will just try and bully you for like inscrutable reasons. Like maybe this person was having a bad day, and maybe they were uh, insecure about their own position or their own achievements, whatever it might be. And it's just worthwhile, as long as you can do it intelligently and live to fight another day, to try and stand up in those moments, because these organizations see it as zero cost to try and crush you in this way. And then the other part of it that I think was really revealing was like, wow, it's crazy what an asymmetry you can have with a tiny audience, like a tiny group of people, and an ability to tell this story. I think anyone could have told it because it was just an interesting story, but can really flip the tables in this crazy way. And so that was also just a little lesson in the value of having a tiny Substack. And yeah, I was grateful for it.
Last question I like to ask everybody. I know you don't live here anymore, but If you were the mayor of New York, what's one thing you would change?
I mean, I would probably want to take on some like large infrastructure task. I bet that's what everyone says, right? Everyone's like a much better set of subways or things like that. Like I really enjoyed when I lived in Bogota for a summer. They had actually this was outside of Bogota. It was in a different city, but they had like some really cool aerial tram systems, kind of like you have to you, what is it, Governor's Island in New York? I forget.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, I would like to see more of
Randall's. Yeah,
Randall's
Randall's
Island.
Island.
I'd like to see more experimentation with that. I think that would be a fun modality. But yeah, probably I would just make some sweeping infrastructure plan. But I'm so out of touch that I couldn't tell you what it should be at this point.
I think they should shut down Broadway, by the way. And they should just
Mm.
make that like an electric vehicle, like e-bike, whatever, like highway essentially. If we do that, we'll all be able to get around a lot easier.
I love that. I love that idea.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, man. Looking forward to reading some upcoming pieces with you and look forward to staying in touch.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to catch up.
Appreciate you carving out a slice of your day to think a little bigger with us. Do me a quick favor, hit follow, drop a 5-star review, and share the episode with one friend who's equally obsessed with building the future. Huge thank you to the team that makes every release sound effortless. Atomic Growth for the behind-the-scenes horsepower, the brilliant Catherine Thayer for steering our editorial compass, and Devin Natoni for getting each episode into your feed right on time. Their work lets me focus on bringing you candid stories and gritty tactics from the founders, operators, and investors, rewriting entire industries. Until next time, keep challenging the status quo, and I'll see you on the next change order.